How many of you have heard the story of the beach covered by starfish? So the story goes that one day after high tide, thousands of starfish have been washed up on the beach and they're all starting to die. One young woman goes down to the beach, picks up a starfish and puts it back in the ocean. Then she grabs another, throwing it back to the waves. Time passes and she returns starfish after starfish to the ocean. But the beach is miles long and she's barely even cleared the area around herself. A bemused passerby stops her and says, "Why are you doing this? There are thousands of starfish here. You can't save them all. What difference can you make?" In reply, the woman picks up another starfish, throws it into the sea, and she says, "I made a difference to that one." I love this story. It's a great fable about the importance of taking individual responsibility and the impact that we can have by doing our bit to make the world a better place. And we know that the problems society faces today, the climate crisis, systemic racism, a global pandemic, they're huge. And we live in a society which stresses the importance of individual actions. And it's true, we all need to do our bit. Reduce our carbon footprint, challenge racism when we see it, hands, face, space. But I don't know about you, but sometimes I can't help but agree with the passerby. Some of the global challenges that we face are just too huge to be overcome by any one individual. But I wonder, how different would that story have been if the young woman had persuaded the passerby to join her? They could have saved twice as many starfish. Better yet, what if she'd gone back to the nearby town and persuaded others in her community to do the same? Well, they could have cleared the whole beach. And that's the power of individual actions when they take place in the context of community. And in fact, we don't need to write a new fable to demonstrate this power of community. There are real-life examples. Let me paint a picture for you. So cast your mind back to the starfish beach, but instead of starfish scattered across the sand, imagine plastic and garbage. And instead of an idyllic scattering, imagine that in some places the garbage is 5.5 feet deep. This is Versova Beach in Mumbai in 2015. And I don't know about you, but when I hear stories like this, I feel a weight in my stomach because of the seemingly irreversible damage humans are doing to our environment. But a young lawyer moved to the area at about the same time in 2015, and similarly shocked by the devastation, set about clearing up the beach. But when he realised he couldn't do it alone, unlike the young woman, he went and gathered volunteers from his community to come and help. And over 2 years, together they recovered the beach, and now it's an area of natural beauty benefiting the community. Making the seemingly impossible possible, that's the power of community action. Because the truth is that individual actions are most powerful when they happen in the context of community. I'm part of a community called People Power, and we're a collective whose mission is to make the planet a more sustainable place. And we recognise that tackling problems such as the climate crisis is only possible in the context of community. I'm going to share with you 3 elements of community that I've picked up on through my work with People Power that can help us face global challenges: empowerment, influence, and resilience. And I'm also going to share with you what I think is the secret ingredient that underlies every successful community. Hopefully by the end, I will have persuaded you that you should join forces with your community to save your starfish and the environment that they live in. So firstly, empowerment. Well, making choices for the lofty purpose of tackling global challenges, like the climate crisis, can feel futile, like a single drop of water in the ocean. And that can have really negative effects on our psyche. In fact, a national YouGov poll last year showed that 70% of young people experience anxiety about climate change. But engaging in community has been shown to reduce anxiety. And in a diverse setting, it increases the motivation people have to learn about and act to prevent climate change. And this makes sense if you think about it, because humans are social animals. Which of you doesn't run faster or longer because you have someone running beside you? We can empower and be empowered by those around us because we're made to feel less alone and because we can learn from each other. So one example from my life is when my husband and I decided to reduce the meat content of our diet. And we did this because about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions comes from meat and dairy. To put that in more context, a typical barbecue has the same carbon footprint as an 80-mile car journey. That's 80. Anyway, so we became flexitarian. And it was a big change to our diet. We had to find new meals to cook, experiment with meat alternatives, and we didn't always remember or get it right. Changing our habits was hard, and this isn't specific to us. Forming new habits as individuals can take between half a month and 9 months, which is a long time, and it can be a dispiriting process. And I'm sure that you can appreciate that if you, like me, have ever made a New Year's resolution that doesn't last past January 9th. And that's before you even take into account the feeling of futility that accompanies making an individual change in the face of global catastrophe. But our community empowered us. We have friends who are also trying to improve their sustainability, and some of whom were already vegetarian or vegan, so we didn't feel so alone. And we also shared ideas and approaches between ourselves, like new meal ideas or the best places to buy our favourite meat alternative. And that made things practically easier as well. Because we felt part of something, suddenly what as an individual seemed like a drop of water in the ocean, in the context of community became a tidal wave of change. One important caveat that I want to mention regarding empowerment is diversity. Much of the empowerment we get from community comes from this idea exchange, and this is most effective when the ideas being exchanged are varied, coming from a variety of different perspectives. So the usefulness of a community in empowering us is proportional to the diversity of the perspectives represented within it. A slightly trite demonstration of this might be that if our friends had only been recommending us meal ideas from one type of cuisine, say French cuisine, we might have quickly got on board and it would have been harder to maintain our motivation. More seriously, evidence shows that a lack of diversity within a community can prevent openness to learning about the climate crisis. So to create truly empowering communities, we must value and nurture diversity. Now, I quickly want to bring us back to the Starfish story at the beginning. Was that young woman making the biggest difference that she possibly could? Well, I would argue that no, she wasn't, because she wasn't harnessing the second power of community that I want to discuss, the power of influence. Making climate positive choices within our communities should be regenerative. It shouldn't stop with us. By talking about our choices, we can influence the choices of those around us, gradually changing the cultural norm. So, for example, over the years, my husband and I have discussed our food choices with friends and family, not with a bullhorn on a street corner, not overtly evangelizing or anything, just chilled out conversations about our choices and the reasons for them. And we're starting to see the effects of those conversations, like ripples moving through our communities, influencing the choices of those around us. So for example, this Valentine's Day, my dad brought a vegetarian Wellington instead of a beef Wellington to celebrate with my mum. When my mum was telling me about this, she said she thinks it is partly because of the steady influence of our flexitarianism over the past few years. despite the fact that perhaps it would have been more romantic if the meal hadn't come out of a packet. So it wasn't the direct result of any one thing that I said or did, but the drip of my husband and I and others within our community changing our lifestyles to mitigate climate change is shifting the cultural norm in a positive direction. And this makes it easier and more normal for people like my dad to make climate positive choices too. So let's all talk to each other about our climate positive choices, because it really does make a difference. The third element of community that we can harness to help us tackle global challenges is resilience. Now, it's no revelation to say that communities have greater capacity than individuals, but because of this, communities are more resilient to disruption. And as part of an empathic community, we can help individuals to face and overcome challenges. So, for example, in the run-up to the UK lockdown, the first UK lockdown, my now husband lost his living situation. He lost his home because his live-in landlord was seriously concerned about the additional risk of infection posed by living with a teacher who was going in and out of school. Luckily, even before my husband asked for support, our church community offered him a place to live. And this was hugely meaningful to him. Practically, of course, because he didn't have to find a new place to live, both while teaching and during a rising pandemic. But also emotionally, because he was made to feel welcome and loved and valued. Because he was lucky enough to be part of an empathic community, the impact of disruption on him was significantly reduced compared to if he had faced the disruption alone. Now I'm going to come on to that secret ingredient that underlies every successful community. And I've given you a couple of clues there because I used the word empathic a couple of times. I think an essential feature to a resilient, influential, empowering community is empathy. So the church community, for example, displayed empathy by identifying the instability of Micah's living situation and the impact on him, even before he was evicted, in fact, and then providing a solution. So let's talk a bit more about what empathy is and the different components of it. Empathy is to understand or to feel with someone, and there are two components. One is cognitive empathy, and this is perspective taking or empathy by thought. It involves logically putting yourself in a person's place and thinking about the reasons behind their actions. The other component is emotional empathy, and this is feeling the emotions alongside someone. So say your friend is hurt and you feel sad, not you feel sorry for them, you feel sad yourself because you're mirroring their emotion. But there are downsides to these two components if they're used alone, on their own. Cognitive empathy can be used badly to manipulate people. I mean, even torturers have to use this type of empathy to understand how their subject is going to respond to a particular torture method. On the other hand, emotional empathy on its own has a bad side too. So in the example before, if you got so overwhelmed by that empathic emotion of sadness at your friend being hurt that you started crying, and then your friend has to comfort you, even though they were the ones who was originally hurt, well, then the emotional empathy hasn't been useful at all, because now you just have two people who are upset instead of one. The best kind of empathy combines these two components into compassionate empathy. Compassionate empathy is understanding someone's perspective and their emotions, and then taking action to help. And compassionate empathy is an essential attribute of a supportive community. Idea exchange to help overcome barriers to climate positive behaviour change is only effective if the community involved is sensitive to the particular situation of each individual or group, and then gives personalised advice. So for example, I have a friend who has a disorder, unfortunately, that results in iron deficiency. and she's under doctor's orders to eat red meat twice a week. If I tried to persuade her to become vegetarian to reduce her carbon footprint, but was not empathic to her particular challenges, then I would alienate her instead of empowering her. I mean, who among us would change their behaviour at the urging of someone who doesn't seem to be listening to us or interested in our particular situation? So, compassionate empathy really is an underlying principle of every successful community. So, what does all of this mean for you when thinking about making a difference to the climate crisis? Well, yes, absolutely, make those individual climate positive choices. Reduce your meat consumption, set up a compost, buy a bike. Take personal responsibility. But just don't stop there. Go further. Engage with your communities. Maybe you do want to do something like joining an environmental community, like People Power. But for a lot of us, engaging with our community can just mean talking with and sharing ideas with our friends and families about our climate positive choices and supporting them to make their own climate positive choices. But we need to do all of this with empathy so that we can reach a greener future faster together. Thank you for listening.